Every prayer you've whispered in the darkness, every moment you've knelt before an altar, every time you've begged for forgiveness from a God you were taught to fear, you were participating in humanity's greatest psychological mistake. And I should know, I spent 50 years diving into the human psyche, analyzing thousands of dreams, studying every major religion, and what I discovered shattered the comfortable lies churches have been telling you. Not because I wanted to destroy faith, but because I found something far more powerful hiding beneath the distortions, something that changes everything once you see it. God isn't what they told you, not the bearded judge in the sky, not the cosmic accountant tallying sins, not even a separate being at all. And before you dismiss this as the ravings of a heretic, understand this: I was the son of a pastor. I grew up surrounded by theology. I knew the Bible better than most priests. But when I looked into the depths of the human soul, when I analyzed dream after dream, when I studied mythology after mythology, I found something that made me weep, not from losing faith, but from finding what faith was really pointing toward all along. The God you worship is a projection. And once you understand what you're really projecting onto, prayer changes, suffering makes sense, and you finally understand why you felt that strange emptiness even in the most sacred moments, because you've been looking for God in all the wrong places. The churches knew this, the mystics knew this, but they couldn't tell you directly because the truth is too dangerous, too powerful, too close to home. Today I'm going to tell you what I really discovered, and it will either liberate you or terrify you, probably both. I was 9 years old when I had the thought that nearly destroyed me. I was standing in front of Basel Cathedral, looking up at its magnificent architecture, the sunlight streaming through the stained glass, and suddenly an image forced itself into my mind. God sitting on his golden throne above the world, and from beneath that throne, an enormous turd falling and shattering the cathedral's roof, breaking the walls into pieces. I was horrified. I fought that image for 3 days and nights. I thought I was going to hell. My mother was a good woman, my father was a pastor. What kind of monster had such thoughts about God? But on the third night I surrendered. I let the thought come, and the moment I did, I felt not damnation, but the most incredible relief, even joy. Why? Because my unconscious was trying to tell me something my conscious mind couldn't yet understand. The God of that cathedral, the God of dogma and doctrine, the God who demanded unthinking obedience, deserved to have his throne desecrated. Not because God didn't exist, but because that image of God was a lie that kept humanity small, terrified, and disconnected from the real divine. That childhood vision set me on a path. I had to understand what God really was. Not what the priests said, not what the theologians argued, but what emerged from the depths of the human psyche when you looked honestly at what was actually there. In my decades of analytical work, I saw the same pattern repeat thousands of times. A patient would describe God, and they were describing their father, or they were describing what they wished their father had been. They projected onto God every quality they needed, every attribute they feared, every characteristic they couldn't find in themselves. The authoritarian father creates an authoritarian God. The absent father creates a distant God. The loving father creates a loving God. Do you see the pattern? You're not discovering God. You're projecting your psychology onto the infinite and then worshiping your own projection. But here's what shocked me. This isn't wrong. This is how it works. God, as humanity understands it, must be a projection. The infinite cannot be grasped by the finite mind. The totality cannot be comprehended by the part. So the psyche does what it must. It creates images, symbols, representations that make the incomprehensible accessible. Every religion in human history is humanity's collective psyche projecting its understanding of the divine. Not false religions versus true religion. All true, all false. All fingers pointing at a moon too bright to look at directly. The God image, I realized, is the self's way of representing itself to consciousness. You create God in your image because God is the image of your deepest self, trying to communicate with your conscious ego. In my work, I identified something I called the self with a capital S. Not the ego, not the personality you think you are, but the totality of your psyche, the conscious and unconscious together. the known and unknown aspects of your being as a unified whole. And here's what I discovered that made Orthodox theologians furious. The self and God are functionally identical in the human experience. When you pray to God, you're communicating with the self. When you feel God's presence, you're experiencing the self. When you seek God's will, you're trying to align ego with self. This isn't reducing God to psychology. This is recognizing that what we call God and what I call the self might be two names for the same transcendent reality. The image of God in your psyche and the organizing center of your psyche are indistinguishable in lived experience. Think about what this means. Really think about it. Every time you felt guided by something greater than yourself, that was real. Every time you've experienced something you called God's voice, that was genuine. But it wasn't coming from outside. It was emerging from the totality of your being, from depths you don't normally access. The self is the God within, not metaphorically. Actually, the kingdom of heaven is within, Christ said. I'm telling you, he meant it psychologically and spiritually. The divine you seek is the organizing principle of your own psyche, trying to make itself known to your limited ego consciousness. When I published these ideas, the religious establishment attacked me viciously. They called me a heretic, a reductionist, someone trying to destroy faith. But I wasn't destroying faith, I was explaining it. I was showing what actually happens in the human soul when faith occurs. The churches fear this truth because it threatens their authority. If God is accessed directly through the self, if the divine speaks through your own depths, then you don't need priests as intermediaries. You don't need doctrine as protection. You don't need institutions as gatekeepers. Every person becomes their own priest. Every soul has direct access. The intermediary isn't abolished, but it's recognized as a guide, not a requirement. This terrifies organized religion because it decentralizes spiritual authority. But here's what the mystics always knew and the institutions tried to hide. Direct experience of the divine has always been possible. The saints, the mystics, the shamans, they all bypassed institutional authority and touched something directly. They met God not in church but in their depths. They heard divine wisdom not from priests but from their own illuminated consciousness. I wasn't inventing heresy, I was explaining mysticism in psychological language. I was showing that what Teresa of Avila experienced, what Meister Eckhart described, what every genuine mystic throughout history encountered, was the self breaking through into consciousness with such force that it could only be called divine. Here's something that will challenge everything you think about religion. The God image changes, it evolves. It transforms as human consciousness develops. In ancient times, God was thunder and lightning, power and wrath. As consciousness evolved, God became law and judgment. Later, God became love and redemption. Now God is becoming something else entirely, something more comprehensive, more paradoxical, more whole. This doesn't mean God changes, it means our capacity to perceive God changes. A child sees God as a parent, an adolescent sees God as a lawgiver, an adult sees God as love. A mature soul sees God as the totality that includes light and darkness, good and evil, creation and destruction. The mistake religions make is trying to freeze one stage of God image development and call it absolute truth. They take the God of one era, one consciousness level, one cultural understanding, and declare that's who God really is, unchanging and eternal. But the psyche doesn't work that way. As you individuate, as you become more whole, your God image must evolve or it becomes an obstacle to growth. The God of your childhood should not be the God of your maturity. If it is, you haven't grown. You've remained psychologically infantile. This is why so many people lose faith. Not because God failed them, but because they've outgrown their childhood God image and their religion tells them that's the only God that exists. So they think they've lost God when really they've just outgrown an inadequate image. Here's where my discovery becomes truly radical. God has a shadow. The divine image in your psyche contains everything you've repressed, denied, and refused to acknowledge about existence itself. Why does evil exist if God is all good? Wrong question. Why do you need God to be only light when existence contains darkness? The answer is psychological. You split the divine into all good God and all evil devil because your ego cannot tolerate paradox. You need clear categories, simple morality, black and white distinctions, but the self, the psychological reality you're calling God, contains everything. light and shadow, good and evil, creation and destruction. The totality doesn't exclude darkness. It includes and transcends it. This is why I studied alchemy, Gnosticism, Eastern religions. They understood something Christianity tried to repress. The divine is not simple goodness. The divine is the union of opposites, the coincidentio oppositorum, the reconciliation of contradictions. When you pray to a God of only light, you're praying to half of reality. The other half, the shadow half, doesn't disappear. It just gets projected onto devils, demons, evil forces outside yourself. You create enemies rather than recognizing the darkness as part of the totality. The mature God image I discovered includes the shadow. Not evil for evil's sake, but darkness as the necessary opposite that makes light meaningful. Destruction as the prerequisite for creation. Death as the partner of life. This isn't pessimism. This is wholeness. I discovered something I called synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that can't be explained by causality. Two events not connected by cause and effect, but connected by meaning. And this, I realized, is how the self communicates. This is how God speaks. You pray for guidance. The next day, a stranger says exactly what you needed to hear. Coincidence? No. Synchronicity. The self arranging outer circumstances to mirror inner needs. God speaking not through supernatural intervention, but through the meaningful arrangement of natural events. Every person who's ever said that was a sign from God experienced synchronicity, not delusion, not wishful thinking. Actual meaningful coincidence emerging from the collective unconscious, from the self, from what you're calling God. This is divine communication that doesn't violate natural law. It works through natural law, through the deep connection between psyche and matter that we're only beginning to understand. Prayer isn't answered by supernatural intervention. It's answered by synchronistic arrangement. The more you individuate, the more you become whole, the more synchronicities you experience. Why? Because you're aligning ego with self. You're aligning your conscious will with the deeper currents of your being. You're becoming who you really are, and reality responds. In cultures around the world, I found the same symbol, the mandala, the sacred circle with a center. Every religion creates it. Buddhists, Christians, Hindus, indigenous peoples, all drawing circles with centers, all creating sacred geometric patterns. Why? Because the mandala is the psyche's natural symbol for the self, the wholeness represented as a circle, the center representing the organizing principle. When you draw a mandala, when you contemplate sacred geometry, you're not creating arbitrary beauty. You're externalizing the archetypal structure of your own being. This is why churches are cruciform, why temples have central shrines, why mosques orient toward Mecca. All mandalas, all physical expressions of the psyche's deep structure. You're not just building places of worship. You're building external representations of internal reality. God is at the center, not spatially, psychologically. The self is the organizing center around which the personality orbits. When you find your center, when you stand in your truth, when you align with your deepest nature, you're standing where God stands in your psyche. This is the real meaning of being in God's presence, not location, not supernatural experience, but alignment. Standing in the center of your own being where the self resides. I called it individuation, the process of becoming who you really are, the journey from ego identification to self-realization. And I discovered this journey is identical to what every religion calls the spiritual path. You start identified with ego, small self, limited perspective. You think you're just this body, this personality, this role, then life cracks you open. Suffering, crisis, mystery. Something forces you to question your assumptions. You begin the journey inward. Through dreams, through analysis, through honest self-examination, you encounter your shadow, the parts of yourself you've denied. You meet your anima or animus, the contrasexual aspect of your psyche. You face your complexes, your wounds, your unlived life. And if you're brave enough, if you don't turn back, you eventually encounter the self, the organizing center, the totality, the God within. And in that encounter, everything changes, not because you've found something new, but because you've remembered what you always were beneath the ego's limited identification. This is enlightenment in psychological language. This is salvation in experiential terms. This is what every mystic throughout history discovered and every religion tried to systematize into doctrine. The path is universal. The symbols vary. Christians experience it as dying and being born again in Christ. Buddhists experience it as awakening. Hindus experience it as realizing Atman is Brahman, all describing the same psychological transformation using different cultural languages. Now you understand why. You've been taught to worship an external God, a projection, an image, and something in you knows that's not enough. Something in you recognizes the truth. God isn't out there. God is in here. And until you make that journey inward, until you encounter the self, until you touch the divine in your own depths, you'll keep feeling that strange emptiness. Churches give you ritual, community, tradition, all valuable, but they can't give you the one thing that actually transforms. Direct encounter with your own depths, direct experience of the self, direct knowing of the God within. This is why I created analytical psychology, not to replace religion, but to provide a path for those who've outgrown external worship and need to journey inward, not to destroy faith, but to deepen it by grounding it in psychological reality. I saw in Christ not just a historical figure, but the supreme symbol of the self, the God-man, the union of divine and human, the whole person. Christ represents what you become when ego and self unite, when human and divine recognize they were never separate. Christ said, "I and the Father are one." This isn't claiming exclusive divinity. This is describing self-realization. This is what happens when you complete the individuation journey. You recognize you and the organizing center of your being, you and God, are not two separate things trying to unite, but one thing that forgot its wholeness and is now remembering. This is the second coming I discovered in the psyche. Not Christ returning externally, but Christ's consciousness awakening internally, the self emerging into consciousness across humanity, the God image maturing, evolving, becoming whole. Every person who individuates, who becomes whole, who unites ego and self, embodies Christ consciousness, not replacing Jesus, fulfilling what Jesus demonstrated, becoming what he showed was possible, following not his historical footsteps, but his psychological pattern. So what do you do with this? How does knowing God is a projection of the self change your daily life? First, you stop looking for God outside. You begin the journey inward, through dreams, through honest self-examination, through facing what you've avoided. You stop attending church hoping to find God there and start doing the inner work where God actually resides. Second, you take responsibility. If God is the self, if the divine is your own depths, then your spiritual life isn't about pleasing an external authority. It's about becoming whole. It's about integrating shadow, healing wounds, actualizing potential. It's work, not worship. Third, you see others differently. Everyone carrying God within, everyone a walking temple, everyone engaged in the same journey of individuation, whether they know it or not. You can't hate someone else without hating a portion of the divine. You can't love someone without recognizing the self in them. Fourth, you stop fearing death. If the self is eternal, if God is the organizing principle of your being, then death is transformation, not annihilation. The ego dies, but the self continues. The wave returns to ocean, but water doesn't cease to exist. After 50 years of diving into the human psyche, analyzing thousands of dreams, studying every religious tradition, here's what I know with absolute certainty. The God you were taught about is too small, too limited, too bound by human projection and institutional control. The real God, the self, the organizing principle of psyche and perhaps cosmos, is far more mysterious, far more paradoxical, far more present than any church dared tell you. It's not separate from you. It's not judging you. It's not even watching you from a distance. It's being you, experiencing through you, knowing itself through your individual consciousness. You're not trying to reach God. You're God reaching for itself through the particular lens of your life, your experiences, your choices. The kingdom of heaven is within. I proved it psychologically. The divine is accessible directly. I showed the path. The God you seek is the seeker itself. I demonstrated it through decades of clinical work. This isn't blasphemy. This isn't ego inflation. This is the most profound humility possible, recognizing that any wisdom you access is the self. Any growth you achieve is individuation. Any peace you find is alignment with your depths. You've been taught about God wrong, not because your teachers were malicious, but because they didn't understand what actually happens in the human psyche during spiritual experience. They gave you doctrines when what you needed was a map. They gave you beliefs when what you needed was a method. I'm giving you both. The understanding that God is the self projected onto infinity, and the path of individuation that allows you to encounter that reality directly. The search is over. Not because you found God externally, but because you recognized God internally. The projection is understood. The symbol is decoded. The divine is discovered not as separate being, but as organizing depth. Welcome home to your own psyche. Welcome to the truth that liberates. Welcome to the recognition that what you called God and what I call the self might be two names for the same transformative reality dwelling in your depths. And now you know, the God you were taught about was preparation. The God you're discovering now is truth, and that truth will either set you free or send you running back to comfortable lies. I hope you choose freedom. I hope you choose the journey inward. I hope you choose to encounter the God within rather than continuing to worship projections outside. I'm telling you from the depths of my experience, the divine you seek has been waiting in your depths all along, not watching from heaven, living in the center of your being, ready to be discovered the moment you're brave enough to look within. That's where God has always been. That's where the self resides. That's where your journey ends and begins, in the depths of your own psyche, where the human and divine were never separate, just waiting for you to remember what you've always been beneath the ego's limited story. This is the truth they couldn't teach you. This is what I discovered. This is what changes everything once you truly see it. God isn't wrong. Your understanding of God was incomplete. Now it can become whole. Now you can begin the real journey. Now you can find what you've been seeking by finally looking where it actually lives, within.